Hey there, folks. Welcome back to the Property Couch podcast. And today we are going back to the future too. We are actually going to revisit the concepts that we talked about back in 2015. Last week we covered the first pillar of 4, Ben. This week we're going to cover the remaining 3, and we call it the property investment formula. What else are we going to cover?
Bryce, I am scratching my head, pulling my hair out. What crazy story is one political party considering in a particular local council in Queensland? Well, I'll tell you all about it. 650% increase. Who's doing what? You'll find out all about it in What's Making Property News.
650%, folks. You need to check that out. Let's rip into the show.
Welcome to the Property Couch, where each week you get to listen to 2 of Australia's leading experts. Bryce Holdaway, co-host of Location Australia on Foxtel's Lifestyle channel, co-host of Escape from the City on the ABC, and partner of Empower Wealth Advisory. Ben Kingsley, chair of Property Investors Council of Australia and the founder of Empower Wealth Advisory, named the 2018 and 2019 Property Advisory Firm of the Year. Stay tuned as they bring you the insider's guide to property, finance, and money management.
All right, folks, welcome back to the Property Couch podcast. And of course, welcome back to you, mate. How are you?
Mate, great to see you as usual. Always look forward to these big shows that we produce every week. It's fun.
It is fun, mate. This one should be a continuation of the fun we had last week as well, because we're actually going and we're revisiting 2015, Ben, which has been fun to sort of go, well, okay, what came out of our mouth in 2015? Is it evergreen? And is it relevant today? So we get to have those conversations today, which is great. But before we go there, Ben, you and I have been on a little mission to see if we can get our episodes plus or minus an hour, Ben. So very rarely minus.
Around an hour.
Around an hour. And I reckon we've done pretty well on that, to be honest. So, but we got I got some feedback on my Instagram from Francis Rivero, who's been a long time listener of this podcast and a great supporter. And this is the message. Hey, Bryce, I hope you're well. Just wanted to throw in my 2 cents worth as I missed out on the poll you said would be on socials. Yours and Ben's wisdom guide is so valuable to so many of us. It cannot be contained in 1-hour episodes. If I can't listen to an entire episode on the way to work, I just pick up where I left off on the commute home and even on the commute back to work the next day if need be. Thanks again for all that you do, Ben. So it's fair to say that there's probably 2 camps of listeners, Ben. The ones that are quite happy for us to riff away until we run out of words, and there's probably some others who go, hang on, I've got some competing things that I want to put in my earbuds, and maybe can you do it around an hour? So there's no hard and fast rule here, Ben. There is one rule. You can't be too long. You can only be too boring. So if we avoid being too boring, we take feedback from our audience around that. So, but, you know, the Stig has spoken and everyone knows that she's the boss around here. So she said, can you guys aim for an hour, Ben?
Lovely words from Francis. So thank you very much. Very kind.
Remember Francis drove down from Bris Vegas, Ben, to our TPC Live in Sydney. Yeah. So, has been a very big supporter. Hey, my Mindset Minute theme today is, I came across this, Ben. I couldn't find who said it, otherwise I'd quote them. But it said this: imagine playing Monopoly and never buying any assets or investments that generate income. Imagine you just went around collecting $200, giving your money to the rich and trying to stay out of jail. That's how most people live their life. Isn't that worth reflecting on? Fair enough. Yeah. Because I sort of thought, okay, well, how many investors have we got in the country, and how many property investors? It's fair to say that that's a reasonable anecdote for life, Ben.
That's what will happen if you actually don't put your money into accumulating assets. It just goes. So, and if you want to have money without having exertion, working for it, that's how you get it.
I like it. Imagine you just went around collecting $200, giving your money to the rich and trying to stay out of jail. There you go, folks. Did that give you a little pang in the guts? Saying, ooh, that hurt. Well, if you're sick of playing Monopoly without buying any assets or investments that generate income, listen to the last statement that comes out of Ben's mouth at the end of every single podcast we've done for the last 8 years. Did you say that back in 2015? I don't think you did, Ben. It sort of
I have
evolved,
to.
didn't it?
Yeah, I honestly can't remember. I know we did the sign off in the different nationality thank yous. I
Those are the days.
we had a bit of fun with that for a while. I'm not sure it was from episode 1. Maybe it just sort of stuck in
No, it
at some point.
meandered its way through the
One of our
journey.
listeners will know when it first started. They could let us know.
So there you go, folks. No one plays Monopoly without buying assets, so why shouldn't you do that in real life? So there we go. Hey, today is another in our Throwback Thursday theme, Ben.
Yep.
So what we're going to do is what we did last time is we talked about what we fixed bad property investment advice. Then we said education versus regulation, and then we started the first of our 4 pillars, which was cash flow management. Today we're going to go and finish the loop on the 4 pillars of mastery. We're going to talk about the final 3 and some of the concepts that came out of that, Ben. So the challenge for you and the challenge for me is to hear these concepts, try and remember what we said, and see if we can bring it as up to date as we possibly can for 2023 for our listeners, Ben. So the first one the first one we'll chat today, concept we'll chat about today, is the second pillar, which is borrowing power, Ben. Now, we spoke about this for the first time back on the 19th of March, 2015, a fair while ago. And here's some of the concepts. We talked about it being a game of finance. We talked about glass ceilings. We covered borrowing options, and we talked about lending priorities, or the tiers of priorities, which we'll go through shortly, Ben. But we recently had a conversation with one of our audience, Ben, who is going to become part of our summer series. And she said to us at the time, she goes, I remember you boys talking about the fact that property is a game of finance, and I took that on board. So we've gone from cash flow management, working out how many of these properties you actually need, making sure you've got a buffer in place, to now going, all right, let's go and buy some real estate. It's not where you go next, Ben. The next place you go is borrowing power.
Yeah, I think, some of the bigger changes that have occurred since 2015 has really been about the macro-prudential interference in the market. If there was one thing that I'd say that's meaningfully different in terms of accessing finance, it's got to be that. So we think about, we did see some throttling around the market share in which a bank could grow their investment lending, interest only lending at some point there. But we've really gone through the whole gamut of throttling done by APRA, and we now currently obviously at this time of recording in November of 2023, the biggest throttle we have on top of us right now is the 3% buffer rate. And what we've noticed in terms of how much people can borrow, you're probably at least 30%, maybe even in some cases 35% from a typical household in terms of the least amount of borrowing capacity you now have based on what's changed in terms of cash rate movements, but also this additional buffer. So if we go back in terms of how we used to assess lending, we used to assess it with a 2% sort of assessment rate. Now that has been changed to a 3% rate. And if you think about the Council of Financial Regulators, which is the RBA, the Treasury, and also APRA, it's very clear when you look at the inflation data that's currently being presented that property is causing some of the inflation, whether it be through the higher rents that are being charged, but also property from existing property. That doesn't get into calculations for inflation. But what does happen is that any new property that's being bought in terms of the cost of those materials do make up some of the inflation story there. And property's about, from my recollection, it's about 20 to 25% of the overall basket of goods that make up the CPI. So why don't the banks want all of us going out and buying more investment properties, especially the new ones? It's because it's inflationary. So even though it's ridiculous to think that from a lending point of view that you're getting assessment rates at 10%, and mark my words, you're seeing now the slowing down of the economy, the slowing down in spending. You're hearing more about the mortgage stresses and all of that are going on. There's literally no logical sense that would say that interest rates will get to 10% or even 9% or even 8% for that matter. It's just simply not possible. But we know why they're doing it. It's another tapping of the brakes mechanism that APRA and the regulators have got. So unfortunately, we're not going to see any change of that soon. But what we do know, and this, if you just picked up the podcast and have been listening for a while, and you are in mortgage prison or mortgage jail, whatever you want to call it, there has been some significant movements in regards to lenders using reduced serviceability rates to refinance existing debt. So please reach out to your investment savvy mortgage broker if that is a situation that you find yourself in because you're paying too high an interest rate. You do have to jump through a lot of hoops to be able to refinance, but they are definitely making concessions for that. Whereas new borrowings, they're not making those concessions. But to the point of mastery, that's the sort of knowledge you need, right? So when you are thinking about borrowing power, there's lots of different elements associated with that. But one of them is knowing the players in the game and how it works and how serviceability calculators works and how having personal loans and car repayments and credit card limits and all that really do affect the amount that you can borrow, is part of the mastery. If you don't know it, you don't want to learn it, then you tap on the shoulder of an investment savvy mortgage broker to be able to get that information out there and present those options to you.
Yeah, the reason that property borrowing power is so important to master, if it is a game of finance, it's because one of the very attractive things about property is it's a story of leverage. So there's a reasonable case to suggest that the performance of shares may be better than the performance of property. You'll always get two camps having a barbecue conversation around that. But we've always said that the central umpire in this is the amount of leverage that you can get against the assets, so you can control bigger assets.
Yep.
And so if you don't get the leverage right, because if you're building a portfolio, it's generally, for most people, it's not about buying one investment property, although statistically that's what most people do. We've touched on that.
Yep.
It's not about buying one investment property. It's usually about, up to four, right? And ideally 2 or 3. So if you get it wrong, there's a whole bunch of glass ceilings that await you, right? Because you may be able to borrow money on paper, but the actual institution may have someone in credit who's a human being who may be having a decision that day to say that you can't borrow, which is why we've always suggested that, and we'll talk about this shortly, but it's not just about getting a borrowing capacity. And I think that's probably the number one rookie mistake that all property investors go. Well, probably the number one rookie mistake, Ben, is shopping around on interest rates. The number 2 mistake is just being satisfied only with the here and now around a borrowing capacity. Because largely speaking, it's about manoeuvring to have a look at what the around the corner, the next move needs to be made. So we talked about in this episode back in 2015, we talked about the analogy of finance being like a game of chess. And I play chess with my 2 boys, and I'm always trying to set up the move to try and trap them at some stage. And it's not until later I realise they've been doing the same to me and I'm getting pantsed on it. But the important thing here is if you were to stack all of your lending with one particular institution, that may provide ease and comfort and straightforwardness. They might cross some security early days. But what you might find is then if you have a broader look at your portfolio, you might qualify for more lending across the market. But within one particular lender, they may place a handbrake on you. So it's all about getting the strategic pieces right, because finance for property is not just about getting a loan to transact and get in. It's about making sure there's enough left over for an adequate buffer. It's also making sure that you've got leverage availability where you can release equity so that you can use that as a deposit to buy another property rather than having to stump up the cash. The game that we're playing is all about retiring out the debt. So you're going to borrow the money, but you need to have a plan on how over time you're going to amortize that debt down to ideally 0. And then there's going to be some conversations around what type of interest that you want to pay based on what is the most optimal. Is it interest only because it maximizes your tax advantage, or is it P&I because the cheaper rate combined with some other factors mean that despite interest only being on paper the best thing for you to do, you might consider doing P&I. So this is Ben. This is why we said it is a pillar of mastery, because it's not just about a loan contract that gives you a lump sum to settle on the property. There is so many things that come as part of the discussion.
Yeah, a huge amount. And also, you're impacted by the cost in your household. So we've seen other big reforms happen there. We've even seen, the ASIC take the Westpac Banking Corporation to court to pay a $35 million fine because of responsible lending breaches, only to find that decision reversed by the judge because ultimately, in the situation presented, the judge was sort of saying it's common sense that people adjust their their spending expectations to allow them to accommodate for their mortgage. So, we talk about the tiers of priorities. People prioritize interest rate first. They prioritize, the capacity, and then the strategy. It's the wrong way around. Strategy leads everything. Strategy is what Bryce was just been talking about. So strategy is things like who's going to value the property on behalf of the lender, and what happens if one valuer gives you a $50,000 better valuation than another property, and you've got $30,000 of additional equity that you can now release, and that's a meaningful number in terms of the type of asset where you're going to buy that next asset as part of that location. Bryce also mentioned to you about cross securitization. So, and to avoid that at all costs. We also talked about splitting your lending, hedging your bets in terms of, being able to diversify your lending risk in terms of one lender. They might have an all monies clause associated with their borrowing arrangements. You've got all of those factors that are just the starting point in terms of what you think about from strategy, and then they influence that capacity. We know that when you look over 40 odd different lenders, that the amount of borrowing capacity can be significantly different between different lenders. We know that some lenders will take 80% of rental income. Some lenders will only take 60%. Some banks will now lend 95% plus LMI for investment purchases. Now that's ebbed and flowed over the journey in terms of a lot of people moving away, or a lot of banks and lenders moving away from lending to investors greater than 90% loan to value ratio. We've seen the introduction of SMRF lending, sort of self-managed super funds in terms of the lending arrangements there and the conservative nature of LMIs and the pricing. And now we're seeing some really super competitive pricing in that SMSF space, up to 80% lending as well. So there's a lot more comfort around that residential story. So this is why strategy always leads the way in terms of then borrowing sensibly to that highest price point that you can borrow, and then look at interest rates. Then make sure you're at the pointy end of the price bus. So we're not saying disregard it at all, because it's meaningful. It adds to cash flow. But to Bryce's point, controlling the bigger amount of property and sensibly doing that with sensible leverage and sensible debt is the story. And that's why there's that natural crossover between borrowing power and cash flow management. You would have heard us in 2015 talk about our assessment rates in terms of when we do our planning work for our clients. 7.25% long-term interest rates. 7.25. Anyone goes, well, that's a bit high. When interest rates were down, when the cash rate was at 1% and you could get borrowings at 2.5%, everyone's going, well, that's not fair. And we did adjust appropriately in terms of putting a 2 to 3% buffer in for the short term. But our longer term models always reverted to that range of 6.5 to 7.25. And has that served our customers well? Well, we hope so. We hope that, by doing that and being conservative enough, they're not part of the group of people who are now selling their investment properties because cash flow is too tight. They will be able to retain that property, and in 5 years to a decade time from now, because we think in decades, not even in years, that they're going to be in a far better financial position, and they wouldn't have had that recycle cost and those replacement costs in terms of getting back into the market. So if that's not enough evidence for you in terms of what Bryce said at the start of the show, that, ultimately, has anything changed? Not really. There's, people are playing around with the mechanisms in terms of the capacity, but from a fundamental mastery pillar, borrowing power still remains at that pinnacle of the 4 pillars that you need to be thinking about when it comes to a game of finance, to be able to control those properties over the longer period of time.
So, folks, to round this out, there's there's options. One, you go to, if you're getting finance, you go to your bank or your financial institution. They give you the best that they have. So they'll give you the best deal that they have within their institution. Then you can go to a broker, and the broker will an ethical, independent broker will give you the best that the market has to offer. So the difference between what the bank or financial institution has to offer and then the difference of what the market has to offer. But here's where the bonus points live. And we introduced this concept, Ben, back in 19th of March 2015. It was the concept of the investment savvy mortgage broker. And to help with that, there's a couple of analogies here. First of all, it's like when you go to a broker, it's like going to a GP doctor versus the anaesthetist, right? So the general practitioner, they see a whole range of things come through their practice that they need to be general understanding across them all. And some days they might have a concentration of one thing. The next day they might have a concentration of others. But in generally speaking, it's across the board versus the anaesthetist. Their job is very clear, Ben. Make sure you stay breathing when you are under anaesthetic so that whoever's performing something on you can get the job done, but you make sure you breathe along the way. It's a very specific lane that we do. So why is that analogy relevant? Well, because investment savvy mortgage brokers are actually pulling together deals for investors as the majority of the work they do. In some cases, 100%, but high 80 to 100% in that range is where they are doing it. So you become good at it. You niche at it. You get the nuance. You're talking to the business development manager of the banks and working at the little 1%ers that experience that. You get to see what this particular client's doing that has some similar circumstances to you, but a little nuance that's different, that they get to see that, and you get the benefit of that. So like an anaesthetist who's specializing, like a gazelle-like focus, that's what they do. The second part of an investment savvy mortgage broker, which I've already spoken to, is the chess game. Playing bits to make sure the move is being thought of in advance. Then the third thing they're thinking is when you go to buy a suit for a wedding, if you're a lawyer, for your day job, whatever that is, you can actually go and get one off the shelf, Ben, or you can actually go to a tailor who's going to get the tape measure out, and they're going to measure all of your main points for them to then send it off to their tailors to make sure that when it comes back to you, it fits like a glove, whereas the one that comes off the shelf has some loose parts in loose areas because they have to cater for the average around that. So I think that's where we really rammed it home about the bonus points in this particular episode, Ben, that broker's better than bank in our view, but investment savvy mortgage broker is more is a better fit for your team if you're going to do multiple properties than a generalist mortgage broker.
And mate, if I could just put some icing on top of that cake, one of the things we've also learned is when you get magnification when you've also got a team of people who are doing that same type of work. Now, we were fortunate enough recently to win, the best brokering business in the country at the Australian Mortgage Awards. I'm very proud of our team for that. And, people were asking me, well, what do you think separates yourself? I said, well, if iron sharpens iron, and we've got 15 brokers who are doing all of that work day in, day out that specialize in this particular space, the knowledge transfer that goes on between 40 lenders and over 1,000 different lending products, it's just hard to beat. It's hard to beat that exchange of knowledge that's going on in that concentrated team. So I think, that's something that we always need to think about when we're looking at that. In fact, I actually asked the manager of the team, Ben, I said, what sort of years of experience do we have? And I think he came back, I'm trying to remember now, but I think it was about 238 years of experience. Once you sum up all the people in the team in terms of who in the broking and lending space. So just an incredible, and I'm hoping I've got that number correctly, but I'm pretty confident it was over 200.
Plus or minus, Ben?
Yeah, well, plus or minus, it was over 200 years of experience. So that just gives you an idea, right, in terms of, so when someone else says no, when your bank says no, when maybe even your other, broker that you've been using for a time says no, that shouldn't automatically be a no all the time. And I know we're going to have, again, on some series, someone who was told no and they just didn't accept it. And they ultimately shopped around and got themselves into a better position to find a lending specialist who got the job done. And you'll hear the fruits of their labour also exposed in the summer series coming up. So it just gives you an idea that, borrowing power, you have to master it. If you don't have the time to learn it, to master it, you need to build someone in your team who's going to be able to do that for you.
Yeah, you're going to need 1,000 lifestyles just to try and keep up with that sort of stuff too, Ben. So there you go, folks. So the 4 pillars of mastery, the second one in order, cash flow management was first. Second one is borrowing power. So lean into that. The third one, Ben, which was the next episode that we did, it was way back on the 27th of March, 2015. It was the third pillar, which is asset selection. So we talked about why we don't start with property first. We talked about the telescope and the microscope. Excuse me. And we talked about what type of asset to buy. So there is a very, very important reason why we're talking about this third, Ben. It's because most people talk about asset selection first. Back then, now with podcasts and people acquiring more information, it's probably not as relevant now today as it was back then. But we found at the time people were coming to us and talking to us about being on realestate.com or Domain at the time and just saying, I found a property I like. And it was the first part of the narrative. And we're saying, that led to the, property investing is a process, not an event. But here, third is a very deliberate part of our strategy, Ben.
How long have we got, Bryce? I mean, we've probably dedicated maybe 40 or 50 pure shows to this particular concept, but it's really important, right? Because, I mean, obviously what you're trying to do is get an appreciating asset. So what you buy here, new versus old, how you go about that process, how you look for that owner-occupier appeal, how you think about, all of the ways in which you're making decisions about how the marketplace is going to behave informs that view. And so we've always built this sort of, that's why we have the classic practicality test and that substitution. So in economic terms, you talk about it from a substitution. So if I can't afford this, what's the next alternative thing that I can buy? And then you've got to try and bring that back into the human nature story and that human behavior story. And, I was saying to you earlier around, ultimately in terms of social activity and what we spend our money on is all about envy. And, I've referred to it as the Veblen effect, which is the very, very high envy play in that sort of luxury area. And I've argued the point that really exclusive properties have that Veblen effect in respect of the higher that they are, the scarcer that they are, the more people who are mega rich, mega wealthy want to buy those particular things. But it does flow down into this whole concept of human economic activity, human interest, and human behaviour. And so, this idea of property is one of our favourite pastimes. We love showing it off. We love looking at it, and we have envy. And with that envy drives further aspiration to live in a location or have a sea view or ocean view or have park views or being in an area that's got all of the amenity and the living and lifestyle elements. That hasn't changed. Now, what has changed and what is a little bit interesting in terms of what we've observed since 2015, that there has been a divergence between units and houses, or more flight to the scarcity of land, predominantly outside of Sydney. So Sydney, you could argue, has kept up their end of the bargain because of its sheer density and obviously, the attraction to being closer to, the most beautiful harbour in the world is definitely, and the beaches along the coastline there, has made that story where certain locations where great scarcity of apartments and accessibility, not being able to build out, or that view to be built out, also has high scarcity and that has seen those particular properties perform very, very well. But more broadly speaking, what we have seen in terms of the vast increases of apartment building that's going on, that hasn't created that substitution effect because we've just got oversupply in those particular areas, and that's why apartments per se haven't performed so well over that time. Now, how far that divergence gets before people start seeing apartments as attractive again, it's impossible to think more broadly and generally speaking that they'll get so much of a divergence that the people will just disregard living in apartments, because a lot of the people who are arriving into Australia have come from high density location, and apartment living could be something that they would comfortably reside in. So I don't think that divergence can get too much further, but it's the underlying land value where the true success story is, and the evolution of what we've been talking about is the productive use of that land is also going to come into play over the decades in terms of, because ultimately it's the land value that appreciates as opposed to the improvements on the land as well. So hopefully that sort of puts you, I summarize that into a conceptual way that hopefully people can take away that and sort of start to think about that.
A couple of things for you to think about with this, folks. Ben's right. We have spoken to this topic a fair bit. So the telescope versus the microscope. So if you're looking through the microscope, you're looking straight at the property, and that's your starting point. So we want you to take the telescope view and actually be looking from 30,000 feet down at the country of Australia and sort of thinking, okay, well, what is the best state that I should be considering right now based on economic activity, human issues, and human behaviour, and then zero in on particular suburbs and then streets, and then finally get to the property. Because we coined this term, Ben, location does 80% of the heavy lifting. It's now said very much across the landscape in the investment world, which is great that it's catching on. But location does do 80% of the heavy lifting. It allowed us to send the message to our audience to say, hey, listen, the main game here is to not be looking at the portals at real estate. The main game here is to be getting very familiar where the land value is valued the most, where people will want to be in those suburbs, and then they will choose the properties based on what they can afford. So that was very, very important. And then we introduced the concept of the buyer's decision quadrant, Ben, the buyer's decision quadrant. And this is really, really important for anyone who's going out to look at property. It certainly helps when I was talking to people on the show, Ben, to help them get the headspace right. But there's really 4 areas that you need to think about when you're buying real estate. And one of them, at the very least, you'll need to compromise unless you are blessed with unlimited money, which most people aren't, Ben. But if you're unlimited money, this probably doesn't apply to you. But if you do have a limited amount of money, it's price, location, size of the land, quality of the dwelling. So for a lot of people in the top left corner of the quadrant, price is generally fixed, right? Particularly given lending challenges right now every time interest rates go up. So price is fixed. On the right-hand side is location, and they don't call the television shows property Australia, Ben. They call it location Australia. So that goes without saying that people often punch in a suburb first when they go into these portals so they can see what's available in the location of choice. So it's at the top of quadrant. Left-hand side, price. Right-hand side is location. Now, if we go to the bottom of the quadrant, on the right-hand side is the size of the land, and on the left-hand side is the quality of the dwelling. So the best way to summarise the size of the land is the aspiration in Australia for a long period of time is to have a 1/4 acre block in a great location with a detached house surrounded by a garden with a hills hoist. That's the iconic, great Australian dream, Ben. But summarised, can I get my own detached house with a bit of space so I can have a garden, right? And then over time, as density's increased and affordability has changed, that 1/4 acre block has become a 650, it's become a 500, it's become a 400. In some parts of inner urban on the East Coast in particular, they can get to 100, 110. So there's smaller bits of land. And then once you run out of size for the land, for the house, you then move to different dwelling types, whether that's a townhouse, whether it's a unit or a villa, whether it's an apartment. But that's the bottom right-hand corner with the size of the land. And then on the left, let's say you cannot compromise on price. You will not compromise on location. You are fixed on the fact that you will buy a house no matter what. Well, then the only place to go is the quality of the dwelling. And that means you can't get the shiny taps and all the latest fixtures and fittings that's in the property. You might need to get a renovate or detonate property because all the other three are fixed. You then have to start from a place where, okay, the things that I cannot change are the location and the land. The things that I can change is the dwelling on top of it. So whatever I can afford now, I will put my roots in, and over time, I may or not be able to add value to that property bin. But that is the decision quadrant that most people need to go through when they're talking about the C word in real estate, and that C word is compromise.
And Bryce, to expand on that and what we were talking about in terms of the location doing most of that lifting, one of the things that's definitely prevalent today is affordability, right? And so what we are definitely seeing is that there's going to be a phase where all investors are being pushed into that lower, more affordable area. So we're probably going to see those locations, fringe locations, doing better from a short-term, capital growth point of view. But here's the thing, and this is what I always say to people when they say, well, does that mean that they're a better investment? Well, remember, you bank dollars, you don't bank percentages. But the other part about that story is, and then what happens then? When they become unaffordable, do they keep growing? And they go, well, what do you mean? I said, well, what happens to them? Do they keep growing? And they go, probably, well, maybe not. I said, well, how do they keep growing? The only way that they can keep growing is if the better houses in the better locations and the better land goes up in value. Ah, of course. Ripple effect. So, yep, short-term stuff, you can definitely go out there and time buying in those particular locations. But if you're thinking in decades, all you want to do is get the best land in the scarcest location that everyone wants to live in. And the reasons behind that comes back to human interest, human behavior, and envy, is the big driver there. And, with these days with social media, it's not really social media, it's social envy. That is a massive driver for the way in which people are going to make their decisions, unfortunately. I've recently done a trip overseas to Bali, and I went to one of those big mega beach clubs, the biggest beach club in the world or most famous. And it was like,
take your shirt off and show all your Collingwood tats.
No, mate. I made sure I had the long sleeve, sun cover on in terms of Marashi.
But you would have fit right in with the millennials.
Oh
then,
my
mate.
God! Talk about the envy and all the sort of people showing off there. Oh, it's unbelievable. So, yep, I said no worries there about who's going to keep spending money and who's going to try and keep up with the Joneses. This generation is going to be far worse than our generation or even the baby booms before it. So talk about putting pressure on, if I want to look successful and I want everyone to envy me, mate, they're being driven by this in the way in which they're learning about social media. It's so I have supreme confidence that property prices are going to keep going up, because remember, the other thing that we also talked about is, as an investor, we want to be a price taker, not a price maker. And owner occupiers buy with their hearts. They don't buy with their heads. So whilst envy still remains one of the core drivers for life, it's not about greed. As Charlie Munger said, it is about envy. And so whilst that still remains a thing, I don't think that's going to change anytime soon whilst, the next 2 or 3 millennia of generations coming through. I think land values and property prices are going to go all right.
Mate, there's a couple of things in there. It's no longer called social media. It's now called social envy. That's coining your term, Ben. But to an earlier point about the short term versus the decades game, I think that's really relevant too, because we have shifted. 2015, we were saying get as close to the city as you possibly can. Now, populations and affordability have meant that obviously that you're moving further out, which is fine. But to your point, there's the short term energy that's going in some of the more affordable locations further out is being dictated to by interest rates, because there is a price point and a borrowing capacity point that means a lot of people are hitting ceilings at the moment on borrowing capacity. So a lot of people are all playing in the same price point, which is meaning that they're just looking around the country and going, well, where can I spend my money as an investor? But over time, as interest rates come back off again, that will mean that some of the fundamentals that we've always talked about that still revert back to the mean over a longer period of time. Once interest rates start coming off, you'll see, to your point, the stuff that is more desirable and people want to be in there because of all the infrastructure elements, people will reset and go back there, which will mean that the longer time horizons will reward the people that continue to play with the fundamentals. So I am saying that some of those areas where affordable are good opportunities. So I'm not saying that that's not the case, but I think I'm just trying to double click on your point where it always starts from the most desirable parts first over a long enough time horizon. And sure, interest rates are meaning that there's that concentration, but that won't be the case all the time.
Yeah, they'll hit a ceiling naturally, and so they'll hit a growth ceiling. It just will not keep growing unless those other higher locations keep growing. But coming back to your point you were making very, very wisely there, Bryce, is, hey, I still want you to take action. Remember, knowledge and power only to take action. So if your strategy is that you've got only an option to get onto the property ladder doing it this way, terrific. And we'll fully support that. Like, it's not necessarily the way that would be. But if you're a time poor professional with good double household incomes, then, if you're coming to us, we're going to keep buying you quality properties in these locations where we're thinking in decades, not thinking in years. But if your cash flow's tight and you need, your deposit's low, then we're going to also make a strategy for you to be able to execute on that as well. But the vast majority of those clients, they want hassle-free, passive. They want to run a passive small business, and they don't want to, to have too many troubles. And usually that, you don't get too many troubles in those better areas.
All right, let's round out this episode by saying there's a couple of quotes in this episode, Ben, that I think will help people. First one was, an average property in a good location is better than a good property in an average location.
Boom, boom.
Folks, if you only just let that land, that will make you a lot of money as a property investor, that an average property in a good location is better than a good property in an average location. And Ben said this just a different way, but to quote what we said, owner-occupiers buy with their heart, not their calculators, which is what the investors do. So
beautiful.
There you go, folks. So pillar number 3 was asset selection. So pillar number 4, Ben, this was episode 6 of our podcast back catalogue, back on the 2nd of April 2015. We talked about defence. So we talked about what the most important asset is, why you need to build a moat around your investment property, and the components to defence. But it's fair to say, Ben, that the defence mastery pillar is the poor cousin pillar. People don't love this pillar. It's a bit boring. There's nothing sexy about
safe,
poor old defence pillar. But it's really the most important asset is the investor themselves, because without the investor, everything comes crashing down. So it's kind of important that we get this right. It's the most neglected one. It's the most boring one. But arguably the most important one. Because if you, as the investor, are the most important asset in this whole wealth building journey, chances are if you neglect this, you neglect it at your peril. So Ben, building a moat, help us out. What does that mean?
Yeah, so let's look at mine and my beautiful wife and kids' case. We've been able to build and accumulate a passive income that's very, very comfortable for us now, and we are adjusting our defence play as those properties and the other investments that we've made continue to deliver that confidence around that passive income. But it wasn't always the case, Bryce. And, our target wasn't always at the level. We've adjusted our plan as per, what I've explained on the podcast before in terms of my situation. So the message here is really simple, that whilst you're in accumulation phase, to Bryce's point, you're going to be the one producing the millions of dollars of income if you're working full time. So if something was to happen to you and you had a medical episode, excuse me, or a medical event or a diagnosis, whatever that looks like, the worst thing that can happen for you from a financial point of view is you have to sell an asset that you've only held on for a short period of time. So it's like buying a really, really expensive bottle of wine and then opening it up, the second year that it's been sitting on the shelf, whereas you should be waiting 20 years before you drink it. So the view is that there is a cost associated with this, and it needs to be factored into how you plan to become what you plan to become. The good news is, as you get older and older, you will ratchet those down as your wealth base and your asset base and income base continues to keep growing. But it's essential. I mean, we talk about insuring a car, we talk about insuring your property, the improvements on the land, but we are the number one asset inside that household. And if something was to go and happen to us or our wives or our best friends or whatever it is that we're in partnership with, those things are material. So we always would be saying it's sensible. Oh, yes, it's boring, but it's sensible to be able to make sure that you're dotting I's and crossing T's when it comes to making sure you've got that defense mechanism in place.
So I guess if you think about the moat that's around the castle, it's there as a safety net. It helps them prepare for what they hope that you never want to happen. So in the case of the moat of defense around the portfolio, it's going to protect three things. It's going to protect your assets, it's going to protect your income, and it's going to protect your lifestyle. So there's some components to this. The first part is if you want to defend your income, let's start talking about defending your income. You're going to need to talk to a suitably qualified financial planner. It is the domain of the financial planner, Ben, not the property wealth advisor, not the mortgage broker. It is the domain of your certified, qualified, independent, capable financial planner. Because what they can talk to you about is income protection, which kind of makes sense. You're protecting your income in the chance that you can no longer earn the income. Trauma, if you have a one-off medical issue that temporarily takes you out of the game, but you need to be covered for that time. And then, or worse, is TPD. It's total and permanent disability. And as the name sounds, Ben, it's not a short-term taking you out of the income-earning game. It is a long-term, forever taking you out of the income-earning game. Because remember, the income is the most powerful part of any wealth creation strategy. Anything you can do to increase your income during the accumulation phase is going to accelerate until the point where your portfolio stands on its own. So, Ben, to defend your income, the financial planner. To defend your cash flows, the defense is to have a buffer. Now, for those listeners who put a buffer in place prior to interest rate tightening, they are sitting comfortably now. For those listeners who are listening to this and it's a little uncomfortable in their household, first of all, we see you, we hear you, we understand what's going on for you. If circumstances meant that they had a buffer, Ben, they would also be enjoying a bit more peace and quiet right now. So that is why the buffer is your defense towards your cash flows. And then obviously you have a defense towards your assets, building insurance, in some cases, contents insurance, but also importantly, landlord's protection insurance, which means that you've got this asset that you are letting someone else use for the quiet, peaceful enjoyment of their life. But in some cases, those people do not do it in a way that is quiet and peaceful, Ben, that they attack the asset, and then you can be covered for not only the repair of the asset, but also missing rent whilst you have to attend to that. So they're the components.
Yeah, I mean, it's just sensible that we're going into a business and we want to mitigate risk. And so, the quote that we used back in that episode was, what defense really means is risk mitigation. And anywhere that we can get that mitigation around property investment, because we're taking on a higher risk, we're taking on higher debt, where we're potentially making our money work harder for us. But if we can't keep that cash flow coming in, that income coming in the short term, then it can fall over. And so it really should be a serious consideration as part of the investment strategy and planning work that you do. And, as I always call it, it's an asset. So when you're thinking about what you're paying for here is an asset that hopefully one day you never, ever really get to call upon. So, because you think about, I'm paying $800 a month. Geez, that's a lot of money. I could be putting that on the mortgage. But here is the deal. That $800 a month could be hundreds of thousands of dollars in terms of support and buffer in the event that I have a health issue. So your health is your wealth. So when I'm thinking about it like that, but I never really want to call on those hundreds of thousands of dollars if I don't have to. But if I do, if I'm roughly 1 in 3 Australians by the age of 55 will experience a diagnosis that will have a serious future consequence if it's not immediately remedied, and or you could be injured in an accident or those types of things, which is also you run the risk of as well. So it just makes sense that you would be thinking about that, whether it be just for yourself. If you're an individual, sometimes you can sort of argue, well, I don't really need it to leave it to anyone else. So you might take a higher risk profile there. But if you've got a partner or you've got kids, it's absolutely critical both of you are insured to make sure that you can provide for the family in the event that one of you are seriously affected by illness or by accident. So it definitely makes sense that you would put that as part of your overall strategy.
And to Ben's point, we're walking the talk to make sure that we are building defence in our own portfolios. And you heard what Ben does. It's not forever. Over time, that portfolio can mean that you are self-sufficient, which is the goal. Let's be honest.
Mm-hmm.
That's the aim. And the more and more confidence you have around that, the more and more you can wind down some of your defence. But in rounding out the mastery pillars here, Ben, for our Throwback Thursday, I want to plant the analogy in people's mind of a four-legged stool. And so each and every one of those legs creates the stability from which someone can sit on that stool without fear of falling over. If any of those legs are to remove, Ben, some skilled people could actually balance on a four-legged stool with one leg missing, but they would remain vulnerable at all times to any shift and change, which would knock the stability of that stool. So what I would challenge everyone is to see it as a four-legged stool, not a three-legged stool. And to be honest, the leg that is most neglected, which we've already spoken to, is that defense. So if you can see that, folks, as the stability is directly proportional to the four legs that you have or the four pillars that you have, then ultimately you can set yourself up for a portfolio that allows you through the accumulation phase to get to yourself into a position where you retire out the debt over time so that you have that self-funding portfolio in retirement. And folks, therein lies the foundation that Ben and I set back in 2015, which formed the platform for every conversation that we had on the podcast, every guest that we brought on to try and add value to you. But we called it the property investment formula. And the property investment formula were those four pillars. So here's the challenge to you if you've been listening to this. If you've been listening to us for the last 8 years, have you got all four pillars in place? Because chances are that may not be the case for all of you. And secondly, if you've been listening for the last 8 years, Ben, and you haven't got out of the starter's gate, you're probably disappointed about the prices that we could have bought real estate for back in 2015. But I said it last week with you, Ben. We'll say it again, that nothing's going to change in the next 8 years. People are going to reflect in the rear vision mirror and say, gee whiz, it would have been nice to put my name on a few more titles over the journey. So, folks, if you haven't listened to those four foundational pillars, make sure you go and check it out. We've got a time hack for you. If you go to thepropertycouch.com.au/TPC20, as in the property couch, TPC20, we've actually got a free binge guide that you can actually get the first 20 episodes summarized so that you can get up to speed really, really quickly, Ben. But it's kind of nice to go back and go, the goal for us in doing last week and this week was to go, let's just double check that everything's evergreen. That's a tick. And let's double check that we've given all of our audience the very latest information here as we record in November 2023, as it applies to those first 6 foundational episodes. But it's always fun to have a look in the past.
It is a ripper, and obviously, each time we talk to this topic, it just hopefully reinforces the messaging. Like, we've done 500 episodes when you think about the bonus episodes and all of those other components that we put together. Fundamentals really don't change much, do they, in terms of what that looks like? So we always want to talk to the latest and things that are happening in the economy and giving people confidence and knowledge. But if you were to really synthesize down exactly what we've been talking about, is like you get those four legs of that stool strong, and you just let time do the heavy lifting for you, and you'll be in good shape.
You'll be in good shape. And I guess the really important point here, folks, is the science doesn't change. It's just the human. It's us. It's the decisions to make and the choices that we make and the little habits that we form and how we view and our ability to be able to. Here's something that hasn't changed, but since 2015, it's the human who has the ability to withstand the negativity that's constantly coming their way and taking action anyway are the people that get to stand here in 2023 and say, hey, listen, I was one of those people that were. I bought a property in 2015. I bought a second one in 2018, and then I bought a third one during a pandemic that no one would have predicted in 2020. So now I've got 3 investment properties, plus I've got my home. I'm now moving towards debt retirement phase. That only happens through the lens and through the action, through taking action, which we're trying to encourage a lot of people to do. So
well said,
very
mate.
good.
Well said.
Hey, my life hack today, Ben, is a continuation of some concepts that I've been talking to you about the Live to 100 Secrets of the Blue Zones. So I'm still with the Ikinawa people, and they have this thing called an Ikigai. Ben, have you come across Ikigai in any way?
No.
There's a book being written on it. I'll tell you what I went and looked up the book. I haven't read the book, but I had a quick look at the summary of the book. And but basically, an Ikigai is some mission or contribution to the world that gives you a sense of purpose. So Ben. So under that definition, the property couch is our Ikigai because it gives us a mission and a contribution to the landscape, and it also gives us a sense of purpose to give back, sharpen what we're doing, learn through teaching, all those sorts of things. But what was interesting about this group of people who are so remember the goal here is what are the secrets to people that are on average higher than anywhere else in the world getting to live to 100? And it was this sense of the people getting together and creating their own ikigai within their village and their community, right? So they have no word for retirement. So there's no word for retirement because they're keeping their minds and their bodies engaged through having this ikigai. And you remember last week or a couple of weeks ago, I talked about the moai, which was where people get together and create that village. So the moai, which is the group of people, in combination with the ikigai, which is the sense of purpose and the shared vision. Because if you think about it at the village level for these people, the mission is for them all to get together. The contribution to the village is to watch each other's backs, and therefore through the power of the community, they then have that sense of purpose. So I really like that, Ben. I think the ikigai is something that if it comes on more people's radars, they'll get a sense of what that is. So the book summary is this, Ben. There's 4 primary elements of an ikigai. The first element, if you could think about this as a Venn diagram, so 4 intersecting circles, Ben.
Yep.
And then the central part of those 4 intersecting circles is your ikigai, right? So the first circle is what you love, i.e. your passion, right? The second circle is what does the world actually need? So that's the mission. The third circle is, well, what are you actually good at? I.e. your vocation. And then the fourth circle is, well, what you get paid for, which is your profession. So imagine if you can combine your passion, your mission, your vocation, and your profession all together, that intersecting circle becomes your ikigai. So there you have it, folks. Folks who on average are more likely to live to 100, and the basics of what they need are quite humble, to be honest, is around having an ikigai with no word for retirement. So there's my life hack today, Ben.
It's a beauty.
Go and check it out and see how you can implement that in your life. So what's making property news?
Mate, in terms of what's making property news, there was another concerning story coming out of Queensland. And in this particular case, the sort of Brisbane City Council area. Now, for those of you who don't know much about your politics, usually inside your council levels, you do have your political representation. So you do have your sort of Labor people, you have your Liberal people, you have your Greens people, and then you also have independents or other party people, right? So that's the grassroots sort of area in terms of where politics plays. Well, what we're seeing out of Queensland is that we saw one of their federal members get elected recently on a grassroots campaign of tapping the shoulder of all of the rental people and the younger people inside that sort of inner city Brisbane area. Max Chandler Mather, I think, is the name of the member now who's in federal politics. But a story caught my eye, right? Because it does look like, federally, they've certainly said there's no meaningful reason, there's no evidence-based reason why you do a rental cap or a rental freeze. Just doesn't make sense, right? Economically, it would just not make sense. It prolongs a problem that, that won't then be solved. You'll take out all the investors or the small business owners. But guess what? The Greens love it, and they're still hacking on about it because it's a political winner to convince people to vote for them. Because if you are a renter and your rents are going up and someone's promising you that, that they're going to keep rents down and do something for you to keep your rents down, you're going to give them a listening ear. So they know that they're on a political winner here. So what was the very, very concerning story coming out of Brisbane was that the Greens are threatening to increase rates. So that's the annual rates that we pay on properties by 650%, Bryce. Let that land. 650% increase in rates paid to, obviously, or due by the landlords. And that, because if they can't get the state government to act, they can't get the federal government to act, they're going down and saying, well, what we can do is enforce this legislation by increasing the rates for landlords who own investment properties in that area. So the small business owners who are owning property, they're running a risk of that. So they're campaigning on this policy that says nearly 40% of homes in Queensland capital is occupied by rentals. So again, it's politically motivated to allow them to obviously continue to keep growing their base. The biggest problem with it is, like all of these types of things, is going to cause unintended consequences. The logical unintended consequence of such a move is that rents will eventually keep going higher and higher and higher because ultimately more investors will get out of investing in that particular location. They'll work out that they made a mistake, but they know. I mean, well, I don't know, right? It is the Greens party. I probably can't give them their economic ability to run it. I can't give them that latitude that they know what they're doing, and and they know that this is a means to an end. I mean, it's a classic case of you got to kill the village to save the village. I'm hoping that they don't take that approach, but my point being here is that they realise that this is the hottest issue of housing affordability and rental affordability in the country at the moment, and they're maximising the political gain on that right now. So once they then get into power or they win the Lord Mayor's seat or whatever they do, and they try and implement that, and then all hell breaks loose and they lose all of these investors, they'll have to change the policy. But guess what? It served the purpose. Remember, they got into power. And so, we just don't want them to get into power because radical decisions like this have significant consequences that take years to fix. And you don't want to have that lack of confidence from an investor's point of view when technically mum and dad, small business owners who are property investors are spending tens of billions of dollars of investment, creating jobs, creating the critical infrastructure, in this particular case, rental accommodation. So it's really dangerous in terms of their political tactician, how they're tactically playing this is a real concern for me. So I just wanted to bring that to everyone's attention. Let's hope that they don't win power at the local government level, because if they do that, we're in for some very, very interesting times in Queensland.
Just a quick shout out to all of our Greens listeners. If you're still listening, that's just the views of Ben, not the property couch. But I think that's summarised best by saying renters beware, because I think the honeypot of headlines that come around thinking that taking the power away from the poor old property investor, thinking that they're anything other than the small business owner, that the narrative that we're trying to create here is just... It's not a bottomless pit for the landlords. And again, to anyone who's renting or who's hearing this or talking at the barbecue conversations with your friends around this particular topic, someone will need to pay. And if it's a short-term win, it's only a short-term win. So I think, in summary, Ben's trying to say, hey, listen, there's a game that's being played over here, which is the game of politics, but the reality of providing roofs over people's heads still remains unchanged. There is someone who will receive a notice either via email or via Australia Post that sits on their desk that they need to pay. And when they make a decision on when they need to pay that and whether or not A, it's worth staying as a property investor, or B, what does that mean for the reflection of the rent that I need to charge for the person to use the space as shelter, will mean that ultimately the renter will end up paying. The landlord won't be able to pass it all on, so they will end up losing. The renter will end up losing because the rents will go up. And then the person who is pushing the narrative, in this case, Ben, to your point, is someone who's playing a game of politics, may or may not have won a seat of power, but it won't make an enormous change to the person that they're using to get that. So we get that a lot of people have different political persuasions who listen to us, and we obviously are very overt in our political persuasions when it comes to the lane of property investing. But I would say the headline here is renters just beware of anything of the honeypot that sounds too good right now to be benefiting renters, because someone has got to pay, and the poor old landlord won't be able to absorb interest rate rises, rate rises, land tax rises, and then no small business owner isn't not going to pass that on. So why would property investors be any different?
Well said, mate. Well said.
All right, folks. So, I think we've covered a fair bit of ground today, but we have rounded out the first 6 episodes in a Throwback Thursday. We may come back next year, that is 2024, Ben, and come and revisit some of the earlier episodes again. But they are the foundational pillars from which we launched this platform back in 2015, and we figured it would be a good place for everyone just to get a little refresher as we go into what is a busy season in people's lives, Ben. Christmas parties and winding up work and oiling the wheel on the trailers and the tents and all that sort of stuff as they're getting ready to take a well-deserved break off. It's just nice to remember the fundamentals. But, mate, until next week when we've got a very special guest.
Knowledge is empowering, but only if you act on it.
See you next week, folks.